Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Carl Jung, there are people who genuinely prefer being alone, not occasionally, not just when they're tired, but consistently. And most of the time they're misunderstood because society tends to assume something must be wrong. If someone spends too much time alone, people start asking questions. Are they lonely? Are they antisocial? Are they avoiding people? But the truth is often very different. For some people, being alone doesn't feel like isolation. It feels like clarity. You may have experienced this yourself. A quiet room, no expectations, no conversations to manage, no subtle pressure to perform socially, just space. And in that space, something interesting happens. Your mind settles, your thoughts become clearer, and suddenly the noise of the outside world fades away. At first, most people don't recognize how powerful this feeling is, but those who do begin to notice something. Their relationship with solitude becomes intentional, not accidental. And this is where the psychological pattern begins. Because people who genuinely prefer being alone usually aren't running away from others. They're protecting something, their internal balance. Think about how most social interactions work. Conversations require attention, emotional awareness, reading subtle signals, responding appropriately, adjusting tone, managing impressions. It's a complex psychological dance that many people perform automatically. But for certain individuals, this process consumes a lot of mental energy, not because they dislike people, but because they are deeply aware of social dynamics. They notice small shifts in tone, unspoken tension, hidden emotions, micro-expressions, things most people overlook. And this constant awareness can become mentally exhausting. So after spending time around others, they often feel the need to step away, not out of rejection, but recovery. This is something many people misunderstand, because when someone chooses solitude repeatedly, it can appear like withdrawal, but internally, something very different is happening. They are recalibrating, recentering, reconnecting with their own thoughts. And over time, solitude becomes more than just rest. It becomes identity. But here is where things start to get interesting, because people who prefer being alone often develop a strong relationship with their inner world. They think deeply. They analyze experiences. They replay conversations. They observe patterns in behavior. And gradually, they become highly self-aware. Now, self-awareness sounds positive, and in many ways it is, but it also changes how you experience social life. Because once you start noticing behavioral patterns, you can't really stop seeing them. You begin to recognize when conversations are superficial, when someone is pretending, when social rituals are performed out of habit rather than authenticity, and suddenly, certain interactions begin to feel strangely empty, not because the people involved are bad, but because the connection feels surface level. This realization is subtle at first. Most people don't notice when it begins, but over time, it shifts priorities. Instead of seeking more social interaction, they start seeking more meaningful interaction. Fewer conversations, but deeper ones. Fewer friendships, but more authentic ones. And when those kinds of connections aren't available, solitude becomes a more honest option. Think about that for a moment. Choosing solitude doesn't always mean rejecting people. Sometimes it means rejecting superficiality. And this is the part many people misunderstand. Because society tends to measure social success by quantity. More friends, more social events, more constant interaction. But individuals who value solitude often operate by a different metric. Depth. They would rather have one real conversation than 10 casual ones. One meaningful relationship instead of dozens of shallow connections. And when that kind of depth isn't present, being alone feels more peaceful than pretending. But there is another psychological layer that appears over time. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. People who spend a lot of time alone begin to build a stable internal environment. They learn how to entertain their own thoughts. They develop personal interests, creative hobbies, intellectual curiosity, reflection. Their sense of stability comes from within rather than from constant social reinforcement. And once this internal stability forms, something subtle happens. They stop needing constant external validation. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable. It feels natural. But here's the part nobody talks about. The more comfortable someone becomes with solitude, the more visible social pressure becomes. Friends might say things like, "You should get out more." "Why are you always by yourself? Don't you get lonely?" And sometimes these questions come from genuine concern, but sometimes they come from discomfort, because people who are at peace alone challenge a common assumption, that happiness must always involve constant social engagement. And when someone calmly enjoys their own company, it disrupts that expectation. So they're often labeled in simple ways: introverted, distant, private. But those labels rarely capture the deeper truth, because many solitude-preferring individuals are not socially incapable. They're selective. They can engage socially. They can communicate well. They can build strong relationships. But they choose carefully where their energy goes, who they open up to, and how often they participate in social environments. This is where the real psychological shift appears. Solitude becomes a form of emotional boundary, not a wall, but a filter. And this filter allows them to maintain something that feels increasingly rare in modern life: mental quiet. Think about how rarely people experience true silence today. Notifications, messages, conversations, social media, constant stimulation. For many people, being alone without distractions feels uncomfortable. But for those who have learned to appreciate solitude, that quiet space feels grounding. It's where they process life, understand themselves, and reconnect with what actually matters to them. And over time, they realize something important. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness is the absence of meaningful connection. But solitude can actually strengthen the relationship you have with yourself. It allows you to hear your own thoughts more clearly, to understand your own emotions, to observe your own patterns. And once someone becomes comfortable with that internal relationship, their identity becomes less dependent on external approval. They no longer feel pressure to constantly fill silence or to participate in every social opportunity. Instead, their life becomes more intentional. They choose connection when it feels meaningful, and solitude when it feels restorative. And suddenly the behavior that once looked unusual begins to make sense. Preferring to be alone isn't always about avoiding people. Sometimes it's about protecting peace. And once someone discovers that peace, they rarely want to give it up. So here's a question worth thinking about. At what moment do you think solitude becomes peaceful instead of lonely? Subscribe for emotional clarity.